Today's speaker is Megan Theriault of Georgetown, and she'll be speaking on artifacts from a wide span of time discovered in Georgetown as representing various groups of people who thought of Georgetown as homes in times past. Megan.
Thank you, Peter. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this working? No. Let's try this. It's the first thing, most important. Hello? There we go. Now I can hear myself too. So as Peter said, my name is Megan Theriault, and I'm going to be giving the presentation today. And thank you all again for coming out despite the snowy forecast. I figured no one would show up, so this is great. What a treat. I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about myself. I currently live in New Gloucester, Maine, but I spend my summers in Georgetown with my family down on Bay Point in a nice little cottage. I work for the Maine Historic Preservation Commission up in Augusta as an archaeologist in both the lab and the field. And when I can find some free time, I try to spend it at Georgetown Historical working with their archaeological collections. In 2009, I graduated from Bates College with a degree in neuroscience, which is not exactly the road you take to become an archaeologist. And it was about at this point I found my first arrowhead, which was in Georgetown, and essentially ditched my hospital scrubs for the screen sifter, and I'm now finishing up my master's degree in archaeology and American England Studies at USM. All right, so this is essentially what we're going to be talking about today, the artifacts of Georgetown. And by this, I mean all the items left behind by groups of people for the past essentially 12,000 years. And I'm supposed to do this in under an hour. So I'm going to do my very best, and I've pretty much chosen to highlight for you artifacts left behind by Native Americans and artifacts left behind by more recent historic groups of people as well. But the bottom line, and what I hope to impress upon you, is that even the smallest artifact, the tiniest piece of pottery, can tell us an incredible amount about both the island and the people that once called this place home. So I put up this slide specifically to show you the archaeological history of the area. On this slide, those little blue boxes actually represent the known Native American archaeological sites in the area, in which there are over 100. And that's not necessarily counting the historic sites. And every day we're finding more as the climate changes, water levels rise, new roads are being put in. So Georgetown's archaeological history is really dense. And that's important because it's already telling us that there's something special about this island. This is a great poster that was put out by the Maine Archaeological Society that pretty much illustrates in chronological order the types of Native American, or they say pre-contact, pre-European contact, artifacts that have been left behind. It begins about 12,500, 13,000 years ago with the Paleoindians, which is who we're first going to be talking about. So who were the Paleoindians? The Paleoindians were the first groups of people to come up this way once the ice caps and glaciers began to recede. They faced a really tough climate in Georgetown. Pretty much looked like the tundra of northern Labrador today. The other thing that's really important is that Georgetown that we recognize did not look like the way it did back then. What I think is most dramatic is that the relative sea level was about 197 feet lower than it was today. And the shore was 12.5 miles further seaward, which is about what that yellow line, here I'll use my handy dandy pointer, which is about what this yellow line represents. So if here's Popham Beach in Seguin, this is about where the shoreline may have been back when Paleo-Indians were here. And they were hunting large game animals like mastodon and mammoth. We know this from artifacts that they have left behind. Now, in Georgetown, our Paleo-Indian artifacts are pretty scarce. One of the reasons could be that a lot of the sites are actually underwater. We have found isolated finds on the surface in Arausic, for instance, and they look like these arrowheads here. These are often called fluted points. They're large, sturdy arrowheads that were used for hunting big game animals like caribou. And this is actually a great mural that you can find at the Maine State Museum in the 12,000 Years exhibit, which kind of gives you an idea of what the environment looked like. So we don't know as much about Paleoindians in Georgetown as we would like to. We're finding out more all the time. Scallop dredgers off the coast have actually been dragging up some artifacts with mastodon and mammoth bones recently. So we know they were there, and we do also know what the climate looks like, which is why it's important to study them. So we leave the Paleoindian period. We're going to come back to this timeline, and we're going to start the Archaic. And the Archaic is a large time period in Maine. It's expansive, it's complicated, and I will do my best to bring you through it. It's also one of the absolute most interesting. And that begins about 9,500 years ago to 2,800 years ago. And essentially, what sets the Archaic people apart from the Paleoindians is that we see a change in cultural patterns on the coast of Maine, especially in Georgetown. So on this slide, what I'm essentially showing you is how this change was occurring and why. About 9,500 years ago, something else begins to happen on the coast of Maine, especially in the Gulf. As temperatures were rising, we saw a dramatic rise in sea levels. This contributed to the large tides that we're aware of today. It's almost like the sloshing of a bathtub. You can think of it that way. And as those tides happen every day, it's mixing nutrients. And those nutrients create pretty much a biological explosion in the Gulf of Maine that hadn't really been seen before. Because of that, it attracted all kinds of different cultures. Now, with the Paleoindians, it kind of sounds like we're talking about one culture. With the Archaic, that is not necessarily true at all. You can think of it almost as a mosaic of different cultures. There's at least how it's been explained to me, all converging on this area over a large period of time, each with their own technologies, rituals, and culture. These are some examples of some of the cultures that are here in Georgetown and that we'll be talking about. So, what's so special about the Georgetown Archaic? This is at the point where around 9,500 to 8,000 years ago, we see the shoreline begin to take kind of its modern form that we're more used to. This is Popham Beach right here, Bay Point. So you can see with this blue line what it would have looked like kind of in the middle of the Archaic period. People start to settle along this coast. They're not transient populations anymore following giant herd animals. They're taking advantage of the marine resources that are right in front of them. And with that, we start seeing these large shell middens. Now, Georgetown has a lot of archaic sites, but many of the shell middens have actually been eroded because water levels are rising, but they still are out there. They're very significant because they're refuse deposits. It's their trash. We can learn what they were eating, when they were eating it, how they were making their tools, and pretty much how they were living their life on the coast of Maine. This is the whaleback shell midden in Damascotta. Some of you have probably heard of it. Before they harvested it all for fertilizer, these were the oyster shells. This is how thick it was. It had probably been used by many different groups for thousands of years. So these are some local examples of some archaic points that I was going to tell you about. What's interesting about all of these points here is that the vast majority are made out of local materials. So Paleoindian artifacts, we see a lot of them are kind of some more exotic materials that they're bringing in to make these high quality artifacts. Here, people are sourcing their stones locally. And by that I mean they're finding cobbles on beaches and around that have been left behind by the retreating glaciers. They're making do with what they have, which help them to survive. So these are examples of what we call an Otter Creek point. This is a Stark point. These are kind of a Neville type variety, and these are some of the earliest points used for hunting large mammals on land, but also marine life. One of the most interesting, unique cultures to happen on Georgetown specifically is known as the red paint people. You may have heard of them. It's also commonly referred to as the Moorhead phase, and I may use those two names interchangeably here. The red paint people lived here around 4,500 years ago, and what is so unique about them is that they were concentrated right here on the coast. Their highlight zone is pretty much from the mouth of the Kennebec to the mouth of the Penobscot on the water. It was a very small community, but it was a really rich and vibrant culture. And there are a lot of their artifacts on the island still today that we can look at. So these are examples of some Moorhead phase or red paint period points. And what's important to note is that there's a distinction in this culture between utilitarian items, such as this arrowhead right here, and ceremonial ones, such more like this. With the utilitarian items, like the other archaic cultures, they usually were sourcing local materials. In ceremonial grave sites, which is a big part of the red paint culture, and there have been some found in the area, a lot of these points are even made and manufactured in other parts of the United States and Canada and shipped into the Gulf of Maine to Georgetown to be used in their rituals. They can be made of banded slate from Ohio, Rama chert from northern Labrador, or chalcedony from Quebec and Nova Scotia even, which is pretty neat. This is an example of not sea glass. This is Rama chert. This is a flake of it that my husband and I found, and it's absolutely beautiful. It comes from northern Quebec. It sparkles like glass and sugar together, and these are what some of their most fantastic points are made out of. So these are some of their other artifacts that have been found in Georgetown. We have some examples, especially over there on the table, and I'll tell you about them quickly. These are called slate bayonets. They're really thin, they're light, they're ritualistic. We've got effigies made out of little animal shapes, little effigies. Right here and right here, you're looking at bone fish hooks. The red paint people were known for catching swordfish. The swordfish used to come into the Gulf of Maine in the warm water and bask on the surface. And the red paint people would go out and they would harpoon them or catch them with baited hooks. They have crescent stones, and then they have gouges, adzes, and other really large stone tools. This is a great example of an artifact that we have at the Georgetown Historical Society. It's a ground stone adze, and it is absolutely beautiful. It was potentially for ceremonial use, just considering how finely it was made. If you go up there and have a look at it, you can feel how polished that end is. It's very sharp. This would have been used, if it was utilitarian, probably for hollowing a dugout canoe along the coast from an old tree. These are some of my favorites. They're really neat. They're called plummets and net weights. Plummets being this large one right here, and net weights, these two with the groove running around the middle. These are also at Georgetown Historical and on the table right over there. So the way plummets and net weights are used and why they're important. Again, they could both be utilitarian and, which is the hallmark of this red paint culture. And so plummets like this, which my husband and I actually found in the area, it's a very finely made artifact. It was probably ceremonial, as were these little ones over here, which are almost kind of anthropomorphic in form. They take on kind of really cool shapes. These two are diagrams of more how net weights were used. So they would put them at the mouths of rivers to catch smaller fish like alewives, versus plummets were often used offshore to catch cod, to weight down hooks. So now we're going to transition to a new culture. And what is interesting also about the Moorhead phase or the red paint people, they arrived really quickly. They also disappeared really quickly. They were only here for a short amount of time, yet their culture was so vibrant and they left all these wonderful artifacts. And in their place, all of a sudden, arrives what we call the Susquehanna culture, which is another archaic culture that took advantage of marine resources here in Georgetown, and they had their own set of tools that are so different from everyone else's. You can see one thing that's really neat, they kind of get these flared little bases here. They're finely crafted, large, broad, beautiful points. They're also starting to make some more ground stone tools, and these are definitely utilitarian. And the way they would do this is they would take a rock and another one, and they would smash it together, essentially pulverizing the face of the stone. And it would come out to something about like this in the end, somehow. I've never tried it. I'm sure it works, but it seems pretty difficult to me. So then it's theorized that it's hafted onto a branch or, a wooden handle, and it's used for chopping. This culture, we see a little bit more of a transition away from marine resources, and they're starting to adapt and use some of the hardwood trees and nuts. And so we're seeing a little bit more changes in that direction. That's what is kind of interesting about the Susquehanna, which is right here, as it transitions out of the Archaic, and we move into the next period, which is called the Ceramic. And the reason we have this transition, again, just like the Paleo, just like the Archaic, is that there is a change in cultural patterns happening along the coast in Georgetown. Some of the theories that have been put forth is that these archaic cultures were so adept at hunting and harvesting marine life that they essentially overfished and depleted the Gulf of Maine of all of its rich resources, causing the next cultures, even starting with the Susquehanna, to have to start relying on different forms of subsistence. So we're now looking at 2,700 years ago to 500 years ago. This is called the Ceramic period, notably because this is kind of when ceramics arrived in the area. And what's interesting about ceramics, again, is we can look at the environment, we can look at what's happening, and we can look at the way people were living and using the land to survive. With the resources in the Gulf of Maine having been depleted, something else needs to change. There have been studies showing that people were growing their own food in this area before this time, but we definitely see a new concentration, a new importance on, they call it, the three sisters sometimes, corn, bean, and squash. It is being grown locally. We have colonial accounts of the first travelers seeing corn growing along the edges of the banks here in the area. They made their vessels specifically to break down these different items, sometimes into soups, and made it so that they could boil and store these new crops that they were producing. So this is a great image. I love this. This was painted by John White in 1585 as he traveled up and down the East Coast and was witnessing Native Americans cooking in these ceramic vessels. They have this pointy bottom that allows them, so you can kind of see it kind of balances in the wood there. And this is just a great image of some of the first, it's some of the first real documented items we have of how people use these items, because up until now we kind of just have to use our best judgment. These are some great ceramic sherds that we have at Georgetown Historical, found by a local resident, and what I love about these is they show you all the different patterns, all the individual patterns that can be on these pots. And a lot of it, sometimes people call them decorations, sometimes people call them patterns. The bottom line is that they're unique, and they're choices that people are making for whatever reason onto their vessels. So with that technology comes a whole new toolkit, and we find all kinds of new artifacts, which is pretty fun. So if you can look at this sherd right here, these little dots were made by what's called a dentate stamp. And a dentate stamp is essentially just a leftover flake from making an arrowhead that they would fashion these little bumps into, and they would stamp these designs, patterns, whatever you want to call them, onto their pots. And we can find, people have found these kind of items here. There are little bone awls and tools that can make these punctate marks. This is a rim sherd that my husband and I found here in Georgetown that's decorated with little rim sherds. And this is kind of what the reconstruction of a pot looks like. It's hard sometimes to find ceramics in Georgetown. They're often in shell middens. And shell middens are very vulnerable to coastal erosion. They're incredibly important for us to study, but the moment the air hits the face of that shell midden and the waves crash it down, these pots just disintegrate. So some of the ceramic points that we'll talk about, these are, this is part of the Mary Leonard collection. We fondly call it at Georgetown Historical, and I put it in here because it's a great image to show you kind of the general styles of some of the ceramic points. Most of them, this one's kind of an exception in this area, but they'll show you the points are kind of getting smaller. They were becoming notched, meaning they were getting little barbs here on the sides with stems, little ears and corners. And this is kind of also because of a change in technology. Some people have theorized that it was about this time when the bow and arrow had come up the coast and was arriving in this area. So points were getting smaller and finer. This is an image of an arrowhead my husband and I found here in Georgetown. It's a ceramic period point. These are some other great ones, and you'll notice with all of them, they're all made out of really cool and different materials. No two are alike. You know, we're not sure if that's personal preference, if it's one person making all the different ones, or did one person make one kind. Most of the materials, again, are all local, though in the ceramic period you are going to find this new preference for exotic materials, and that's coming from increased communication and trade networks up and down the East Coast and out west. But these all here are mostly local. This is Munsungan chert from northern Maine. These are some of my favorites. They're called Lavana points. They're little triangular points. And what's neat about these is that they were made about 1,000 to 500 years ago. So they're some of the most recent points we'll find here in Georgetown. And some have even been found on the earliest colonial sites here in the area, which, you know, may indicate some sort of interaction between natives and the first colonists. We know that they were trading. We know that they were communicating. We have land deeds showing this communication. So these are some of the most recent things that we'll find. So we're now going to move into historic artifacts. I've taken you through pretty much 13,000 years. 13,000 years really quickly. And I hope you're able to retain some of that and what we were able to learn. But again, with prehistoric artifacts, we don't have documents and data. We can't Google these, you know, these individual people. Why did you use this? Why did you do it that way? So we have to use our best judgment. With the historic items, it's a lot easier, and Google is really handy, actually. So we all know about the Popham colony, right? Which is incredibly important because it was the first settlement in Maine, let alone the area. And so we have a really rich history, again, here on the coast. Due to, you know, it's a very strategic location, there's a lot of resources. And so you get the Popham colony settling, you get interactions with the Native Americans, and you get a whole new set of trash to find. So one of the coolest, I think, is called ship ballast flint. And essentially you'll be walking along the beach and all of a sudden you'll find these bizarre looking nodules of rock and you'll have no idea what it is. And essentially what it was is that as these large ships came over, stones, sometimes bricks, but flint also, was stored in the bottom of the boat, and it was called ballast. And it was meant to counteract and balance these large mass sticking up from the top of the boat. And there have been theories or documents at least of ships sailing into a port and all of a sudden finding themselves in shallow water and people quickly bailing and throwing this stuff off overboard in hopes to raise the level of the hull. So, you know, maybe someone was sailing through here and got in a little bit of trouble, maybe towards the gut in between Indian Point and Stage, and threw a bunch of stuff overboard. It's pretty neat. So we'll also look at colonial gunflints. So gunflints are really neat. Ours here that we find on the coast come in a range of colors, and that is something kind of unique to Georgetown in this area. The reason being that most gunflints that are studied come in, you know, two varieties. That's how they tend to classify them on historic sites. Blonde for French, come from France. Black comes from England. But as you can see, we have a whole rainbow of gunflints here. And sometimes, if you look closely, you're able to identify the types of rocks. And you start to realize that some are made out of local materials, some are made out of materials from Nova Scotia. And you start to see patterns here of colonists and Native Americans probably interacting, locally sourcing, locally trading. So there's a lot more going on here between these two groups. The Native Americans didn't just go away when the colonists arrived. There's still a lot of interaction here. And then this is just a diagram if anyone is confused. A gun flint is used in a flintlock rifle or pistol. Pretty cool. So this is just really neat. I just thought this was awesome. This is at Georgetown Historical. It's a cannonball. It was found on Mile Beach at Reed State Park in 1814. I don't know who found it. It's just awesome. So this is also one of my favorite types of artifacts to find. These are clay tobacco pipes. This is a picture I took this past summer of some of the stem pieces. Stems are these long ones there, and the bowls are here. And they're all different. You can see this one says Scotland. This one has designs on it right here. And what's really neat about clay tobacco pipes is that we can date them pretty definitively by, it's pretty primitive. We just use drill bits that we drill into a block like this. We put them on, and you can measure the diameter of the borehole, or essentially where the smoke is drawn out of. And the earliest pipes have the largest boreholes. And as you go through time, they get thinner. And so there's been a few theories as to why this is. One being that as tobacco became more refined and smaller, people decided to make the borehole more narrow, essentially so you're not inhaling bits of the tobacco into your lungs as you're smoking. The other thought was that people really were liking to smoke tobacco all the time. This is, like our cigarette butts today. And so they started to make the pipe bowls a lot larger. And when they did that, you could, smoke a lot more at once. They got really hot. And so you had to make the stem a lot longer, and it had to be thinner. They essentially stretched it out to compensate for that larger pipe bowl. Coins. We find a lot of coins in Georgetown. You can see, I found things in my own yard from like the 1950s, but these are Indian head pennies and Mercury head dimes. And specifically, I was going to tell you a little about this one right here, which is pretty neat. This is a half penny from the 1760s. And so the reason it's cut in half may be a number of reasons. One theory is that a large cent coin around that time was probably worth about 20 cents to us today. And somebody wanting to be resourceful decided to chop it in half and make a half cent. And half cents like this only constituted about 1% of the total market of coins at that time. And they're really cool items. Another theory I read about half cents said that in a pinch, maybe someone needed a sharp edge to cut a thread. And so they took out their axe, chopped it in half, and cut whatever they needed. So there are many different theories. We don't always know, but it's a really cool, unique find that somebody definitely changed and did something to, and it's got a story. So buckles and brooches. My next few slides are actually going to address kind of a set of artifacts that came from, we call it locally, the Campbell Foundation in Georgetown. It's down off a little finger in Georgetown, and a local resident was there a number of years ago and found all these amazing artifacts, documented them, and so generously donated them to GHS for us to study. And I found a few really cool things looking at them the past few weeks. This is, they think it's a belt buckle, a gold-plated belt buckle. We have it up there. You can feel it. It's really heavy. It's awesome. So this here looks like, a little heart brooch, right? There's actually a lot more to this brooch than meets the eye. It's called a Luckenbooth brooch. So when I was doing my research, I found out that these little heart brooches originated on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, Scotland. If you're at Disney World or a theme park and you go on a ride and you get out, what's the first thing they do? They funnel you through a gift shop, right? So in Edinburgh on the Royal Mile, you can see here, this was called the toll booth. This is the chapel and the toll booth. People had to come through here, and then what is this? These are the Luckenbooths. Essentially, a Luckenbooth was right after you went through the toll, you were inundated with little pop-up trinket shops. And these brooches originated there, and they were sold kind of as Scottish love tokens between the 18th and 19th centuries. So they're pretty cool little items that definitely have a story. So buttons, some of my favorite things to find on the island. They're all so unique. Especially I love this one. This is a little glass one with stars. My husband and I found on a beach right near Bay Point, which was really cool. So what's so great about buttons? So you can actually tell an immense amount about buttons by just simply looking at them and Googling them. This one I Googled. This comes from that same Campbell Foundation with that giant belt buckle and that Luckenbooth brooch. So this button right here, all I Googled was button with a thistle and a crown. Wait till you see what I got. This comes from, oh, so much, I couldn't believe it. This is a blazer button from the Royal Blackheath Golf Club in London. It was manufactured between 1800 and 1844 by J. McGowan in London. Right? Long lost relative. So I thought that was really cool. So then you start seeing a pattern. You've got a Luckenbooth brooch that's kind of hails from Edinburgh. You've got this blazer button coming from London. So maybe somebody at that foundation was either from this area or had visited it, which is pretty neat. So marbles. You know, people lose their marbles all the time. It's pretty common, especially kids, right? So marbles are so much of what we find. Some of them are beautifully frosted in sea glass like this one right here. And you wouldn't necessarily think you could tell that much about a marble, right? You'd actually be wrong. These marbles are not your ordinary marbles. They are cod neck bottle marbles. And a cod neck bottle was manufactured in London around 1872. And it was a new method to store a carbonated beverage. Up until this point, carbonated beverages were stored with a cork, but they had a problem. The cork would dry out, letting all the carbonation out, so bottles were stored on their sides and then they got moldy. So this was the newest idea. They essentially would carbonate this bottle from below. The marble would pop up like a stopper and the pressure would keep it there. You had this fancy little tool that you essentially popped it down with, and there's your nice fizzy soda. The other problem, though, is that you were supposed to return these bottles to get them refilled, and any kid that got their hand on them did not do that. They immediately smashed them and took the marble out of the bottle, obviously, to play with. So cod neck bottles today, if you can find an intact one, it's worth a ton of money, it looked like. On eBay, there were thousands. So pottery is one of my favorite things to look at because it's so flamboyant. There's so many clues as to what you can find out from a single piece of pottery. The one I was going to show you right here is one of my favorites and one of the most common you're going to find. It's called blue willow, which I'm sure many of you are really familiar with. So you saw, if we go back, there's that willow branch right there. You can see it right there. So blue willow started to be manufactured around the 1780s, and it was manufactured for over 200 years. It's an incredibly prevalent pattern, and most likely the reason you find all these pottery bits strewn about, often on beaches, is because people, they'd break a plate, you know, serving dinner, get in a fight and throw it, I don't know, and then throw it over the dock. That was their dump. And so now people like me who think that's really cool go down under there in the stinky mud and pick these things up. So this is one of my favorite ones also. I love collecting pottery that has maker's mark stamps on them. I think it's really neat because you can trace so much evidence from just these little marks. So I Googled this one, and this is what I came up with. It was manufactured in 1930 by Taylor Smith and Taylor Company. It was their pastoral design. And this is what it looked like in the middle, right here. Beautiful. And actually, I was looking just today, just this morning, over in my bottle of blue pottery that I brought over there, and I saw a piece of this in it, the actual pattern. It's really cool. I'm probably going to go dig it out in a minute when I'm done. So it's pretty neat. All right, so this is kind of the grand finale. And I saw some of you over there wondering, what is this? What is this artifact over there, this giant stone ball? Does anyone have any idea? I heard a lot of theories earlier, so I know some of you have them. Anyone? No? Cannonball. Cannonball? No. It's a good guess. Essentially, we don't know either. I have no idea, but it's still really cool. But what we do know about it, this is at Georgetown Historical, is that, I'm going to walk over here and get it for a second, is that it's really heavy, the local kiddos used it in their plays. Now, they had a wooden stage, so it's not going to work as well as it would here, but they called it a thunderball. And what they did is they rolled it behind the curtain on the wooden stage during their plays to make thunder. And so I'll do it. It won't be as good, but you can hear. And then on a wooden floor, it would make that noise. So most likely, though, the cool thing about this is that the kids at the Georgetown school weren't the first ones to use it. Somebody probably found it on the island, and it's probably an item that's actually been used for thousands of years by many different groups of people. And that's kind of the point, is that the smallest item has so much to tell you, and Georgetown specifically, its history is absolutely so rich, and there's so much to learn. So my final slide, if you have questions, I absolutely love to hear from you and see what you have. I try to document local collections. I have a local collection I'm happy to share with people, and so please email me, and I'd love to chat with you. So it's good, I'm all done. I'm done. See what we can. Well.